The life of Franz Kafka reads almost like one of his stories, strange, unsettling, and full of contradictions. Born in Prague in 1883, Kafka became one of the most haunting literary voices of the 20th century. Yet during his lifetime, few people outside a small circle of friends even knew his name. Today he is remembered for his nightmarish tales of alienation, guilt, and absurdity. But the details of his life often sound as bizarre as his fiction. Take, for instance, the first curious fact. Kafka worked for most of his adult life at an insurance office. Every morning he would walk through the streets of Prague, past Gothic spires and bustling trams, to the Workers' Accident Insurance Institute, where he calculated the risks of industrial machinery accidents. By day, he produced reports with clinical precision. By night, he poured his unease into stories about human beings crushed by incomprehensible forces. Historians still debate whether Kafka's bureaucratic career stifled his creativity or whether it fueled the imagery of oppressive systems that fill his works. But stranger still is how Kafka regarded his own writing. He often felt ashamed of it, calling his works nothing but literature, as though they were an embarrassing indulgence. In 1924, as he lay dying of tuberculosis at just 40 years old, he left instructions for his closest friend, Max Brod. Burn everything, unfinished manuscripts, letters, diaries. Brod ignored him, preserving instead The Trial, The Castle, and America, the very works that would secure Kafka's place in literary history. Scholars still wrestle with this paradox. Was Kafka genuinely intent on erasing himself, or was his plea for destruction another gesture of his self-torment, secretly hoping his friend would defy him? Without Brod's disobedience, the world might never have heard of Kafka at all. The strangeness of Kafka's world was not just in his words, but in his habits. He believed in strange health regimens, practicing a strict vegetarian diet long before it was fashionable. He was fascinated by raw food, nuts, and milk, and could often be seen chewing his food with almost obsessive slowness, insisting it must be masticated 30 times before swallowing. He was also devoted to calisthenics and open-air swimming, cutting an odd figure in Prague with his wiry frame plunging into icy rivers. Some historians argue that these health obsessions were a desperate attempt to control his frail body, which was racked by illness. Others think it was simply part of his restless search for purity. Whatever the case, you can almost imagine Kafka pacing the riverside, pale and serious, plunging into the freezing waters as if to wash away the anxieties of modern life. Another of Kafka's strangest quirks was his obsession with animals. His stories are full of them. The ape who delivers a lecture in A Report to an Academy, the talking mouse in Josephine the Singer, and most famously, the salesman who wakes up as a giant insect in the Metamorphosis. Kafka himself kept notebooks filled with observations about animals, as though he half believed they possessed some secret knowledge denied to humans. Scholars disagree whether this fascination was philosophical, an attempt to question the human condition, or psychological, reflecting Kafka's deep identification with the powerless and misunderstood. His diaries reveal he once visited a Berlin zoo and stood transfixed before the monkeys, convinced he recognized something of himself in their movements. Kafka's life also intersected with love in peculiar ways. He was engaged 3 times, twice to the same woman, Felice Bauer, but each time he pulled away in panic. He wrote her hundreds of letters full of longing but also of dread, sometimes declaring his devotion, other times pleading for release. One scholar has called his engagement to Felice a kind of trial before marriage, echoing the endless deferrals of his fiction. Historians still argue, did Kafka sabotage himself out of fear of intimacy, or was he simply too consumed by writing to share a household? What we know for certain is that these failed romances became the soil in which his anguished stories of failed connections and impossible obligations took root. Among the oddest episodes in Kafka's life occurred in Berlin, when he encountered a little girl crying in the park. She had lost her doll. To comfort her, Kafka invented a story. The doll had not disappeared, but gone on a journey. Each day afterward, he returned with letters supposedly written by the doll, describing her adventures across the world, Paris, Spain, faraway lands. Eventually, Kafka presented the girl with a new doll, claiming it was her old companion, now returned from her travels. In a way, it was Kafka's gentlest story, an act of fiction not for publication, but for kindness. Scholars still marvel at this tale, wondering whether the girl, if she lived long enough, ever realized the stranger in the park was one of the century's greatest writers. Even Kafka's sense of humor, often overlooked, was peculiar. Though his works are drenched in darkness, his friends recalled him bursting into laughter while reading his stories aloud. Imagine the young Kafka, thin and intense, giggling at the absurdity of a man transformed into a bug. Was it nervous laughter, or was he teaching his audience that the grotesque is also comic? Historians continue to debate whether Kafka's works are tragedies, comedies, or some uncanny fusion of both. The weirdness of Kafka's existence extended to his relationship with language and identity. Though he lived in Prague, his first language was German, the tongue of the ruling minority, while his Jewish family spoke Yiddish in private. He felt perpetually caught between worlds, German yet not German, Jewish yet alienated from traditional Judaism, Czech by birthplace yet detached from Czech nationalism. He once confessed he belonged nowhere and everywhere. Some scholars argue that this in-between status explains the dreamlike alienation of his writing, where characters are always outsiders in a hostile world. Others claim Kafka deliberately exaggerated his marginality, using it as fuel for his art. What is certain is that Kafka's multilingual, multi-ethnic world shaped a voice that felt universal precisely because it belonged to no single place. His physical appearance, too, contributed to the legend. Tall, gaunt, with deep-set eyes, Kafka had an aura that friends described as both magnetic and spectral. He cultivated a quiet intensity, often dressing with meticulous neatness, yet he carried an air of fragility, as though he were already halfway into his own stories. One acquaintance said he looked like a saint from an old painting. And yet this ghostly figure loved slapstick theater, especially the comedies of Chaplin, and could mimic the antics of actors with uncanny skill. Here was another paradox. The writer of nightmares entertained his friends with physical comedy. Perhaps one of the strangest aspects of Kafka's legacy is that his name itself became an adjective, Kafkaesque. Today it describes nightmarish bureaucracy, surreal ordeals, or oppressive absurdity. But Kafka himself never lived to see this. In his lifetime, he published only a handful of short works, often in obscure journals. His books were largely ignored. The term Kafkaesque only gained traction decades later, as readers recognized in his stories a mirror of the totalitarian regimes and bureaucratic nightmares of the 20th century. Yet scholars argue, does the term distort Kafka's meaning? To call something Kafkaesque is to place it in a category, yet Kafka's genius was to resist categories altogether. The last years of his life added to the strangeness. Tuberculosis ravaged his body, and he could barely swallow food. He died at the age of 40 in a sanatorium near Vienna. Among his last writings was a haunting fragment about a man who could not eat because food turned to ash in his mouth, a chilling echo of Kafka's own illness. His burial in Prague drew little attention at the time. Who could have guessed that this quiet funeral marked the passing of one of modern literature's giants? What makes Kafka's life even stranger is how much remains uncertain. Scholars debate endlessly over his manuscripts. Were his stories allegories of political oppression, or personal nightmares about his domineering father? Was the trial a protest against bureaucracy or an internal drama about guilt and desire? Even his most famous story, The Metamorphosis, sparks arguments. Why did Kafka describe Gregor Samsa not as a specific insect, but vaguely as ungeheures Ungeziefer, a monstrous vermin? Was it intentional ambiguity, or did Kafka fear the grotesque image would collapse into parody if made too clear? Readers still argue whether Gregor's plight is tragic, comic, or both. Another point of debate surrounds Kafka's sexuality. His letters reveal both fascination and anxiety about intimacy. He frequented brothels but also recoiled in guilt. He idolized women, yet feared being consumed by marriage. Some scholars read his stories as coded reflections of sexual dread. Others see them as broader metaphors for human vulnerability. The uncertainty only deepens the aura of strangeness around his life. And then there is the puzzle of his unfinished works. The Castle, for instance, breaks off mid-sentence, as though Kafka had simply put down his pen and never returned. Did he intend to finish it? Or was the endless incompleteness itself the point? Some critics suggest that the lack of resolution is not a flaw but a deliberate gesture, that the stories of modern life cannot end neatly because life itself never does. Others think Kafka simply lacked the strength, his health collapsing before his imagination did. Either way, the fragments he left behind feel eerily appropriate, worlds without exits, like corridors that twist forever. The survival of these fragments brings us back to Max Brod. By ignoring Kafka's order to destroy his papers, Brod altered literary history. Yet not everyone agrees this was noble. Some argue that Kafka's wishes should have been respected, that to preserve against his will is a betrayal. Others reply that art belongs not only to its creator but to the world, and that the moral weight of Kafka's voice outweighs his private despair. This debate continues to this day, hovering over every page of Kafka we read. In the end, what are we left with? A man who worked in insurance by day and invented strange parables by night. A writer who begged to be forgotten but became immortal. A figure who laughed at his own dark tales and comforted a child with stories of a traveling doll. Kafka's life is a web of contradictions, austere yet playful, fragile yet disciplined, despairing yet compassionate. Each fact about him seems a little odd, a little off-kilter, as though reality itself bent strangely around him. Perhaps the weirdest fact of all is that Kafka, who felt himself insignificant, has become a symbol of the modern age. His stories anticipate the machinery of bureaucracy, the alienation of cities, the paranoia of surveillance states. When readers confront his work, they often feel an uncanny recognition, as though Kafka somehow lived ahead of his time, recording nightmares that had not yet arrived. Is it mere coincidence, or does it reveal something universal about the human condition, that to be modern is to be Kafkaesque? Imagine walking through Prague today. The cobbled streets still echo with the clatter of trams, and tourists gather outside Kafka's childhood home. In the museums, his manuscripts lie under glass, pages filled with looping handwriting, lines that trail into nothing. Somewhere, perhaps, a little girl's doll still waits, carrying with it the kindness of a man too often remembered only for his darkness. And in libraries across the world, his unfinished stories continue to whisper. They remind us that life itself may be incomplete, ambiguous, and strange. And yet, like Kafka, we must find a way to laugh in the shadows. So we return to the beginning, 10 strange facts that are more than trivia. They are windows into the mind of a writer who saw the world differently. Kafka worked as an insurance clerk, begged for his writings to be burned, obsessed over animals, failed at love, invented stories for a lost doll, laughed at his own horror, lived between languages, became an adjective, left works unfinished, and remains a puzzle of interpretation. Each fact is a fragment, but together they form the outline of a life that was as uncanny as his fiction. To read Kafka is to enter a world that feels eerily familiar yet unsettlingly foreign. To know his life is to realize that sometimes truth itself is stranger than literature. And perhaps that is why Kafka endures, because his life, like his stories, teaches us that the bizarre is never far away. It lives in the everyday, waiting for us to notice.